Hello everyone, and welcome to another edition of our supplementary videos on our series Origins, the book of Genesis. In this episode, I want to talk a little bit about one of the big questions that often comes up when we're talking about Genesis 2 and Genesis 3, and that is, are Adam and Eve historical people, or is this just an allegory? Is it a fable? Is it mythology? What are we to do with these texts about Adam and Eve? They're kind of strange. They come to us in a very different way than Genesis 1, which was a very orderly account of creation. And now we have this whimsical account of God making a human out of dust, creating a woman out of the side of the man or the rib of the man. And then in Genesis 3, which we're going to talk about this week, about their exploits in the garden and how that applies to all of us as humanity, because the Bible over and over again connects us back to Adam and Eve. What's our relationship to them? Are they historical people? And if so, in what way? So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that. And we're going to look first, though, at the idea of history versus mythology. Now, when we think about history and mythology, we tend to have a lot of different assumptions about what we mean by those words. History, for example, we assume that is about verifiable facts. Think of Sergeant Friday from Dragnet, for those of you of a certain age. Just the facts, ma'am. Just the facts. That's what we want history to be. It's verifiable by evidence, what really happened. Whereas we think of mythology as fictional stories, fairy tales, something that describes something fantastical, but yet may have some moral value to us when we hear the story. Now, we have those defined as two separate categories, but for people in the ancient world, they would not have recognized those categories at all. They lived in what we call a storied world, where the lines between myth and history were often very blurred. There are events that happen, but the way that they're interpreted is not according to empirical, verifiable, chronological facts, but rather according to the needs of the interpreter and what he wants to get across to the audience. There are challenges even to reading modern history. I'm recording this in my home office, and you see behind me is just part of my Civil War book collection. On the shelf behind me, there are, I think, around 75 books that are just on the Battle of Gettysburg. It might actually be more than that. And people ask, why are there so many books on one particular battle? Do we need that many books? Well, what's interesting about it is, for an event that happened just over 160 years ago, we're still trying to figure out in many places on the battlefield what actually happened. How do we look at the evidence? One person says one thing, one person says another. It happened at this time, it happened at that time. There were this many men, there were that many men. Over and over again, we're trying to figure out what really happened as much as we can through primary sources, eyewitness sources, through secondary sources, others who've done research over the years, to get multiple points of view. So to get at what really happened, there are places on the battlefield even today where you can go and say, we think this is what happened, but we're not exactly sure. History's not a definitive science. We call it a social science, but it's not precise. Memory has a lot to do with it. Evidence has a lot to do with it. How we interpret evidence has a lot to do with it. Our slants and biases. When people talk about objective history, it's pretty easy to say there's really no such thing. We all come at it from a particular point of view. Ancient sources, in terms of history, really come from oral tradition. They start over time. These stories are told over and over again, and then they're incorporated into written documents later. The sources are often written long after the events. I think about the histories about Alexander the Great, for example, many of them written much later than Alexander, taking maybe some eyewitness accounts of different places, but really expanding on them over a long period of time. It's not till you get to about the 6th century or the 5th century BC, where Herodotus is considered to be the father of modern history. He writes about the Greco-Persian Wars and uses different sources. He actually interviews both Greek and Persian sources. That was a novelty at the time. So he's considered to be the father of modern history because he's trying to get to the facts. But this is long after the events of Genesis and even the events of the Old Testament might have taken place. So we've got to keep that in mind when we're thinking about history. Now, mythology, on the other hand, we often think of that as merely fiction, but it's not just fiction. Oftentimes, literary people use mythology as a way of talking about the founding stories of a culture. And that can have a mix of truth and a mix of fantasy or embellishment to it, but it's all designed, again, to make a point. Think about it. Our own country has its mythology. Think about George Washington, for example. The stories about young George Washington. I cannot tell a lie, I chopped down the cherry tree. That probably didn't happen. It was a story invented by Parson Weems, writing one of the early lives of Washington. But it's a story we love to tell, and we continue to tell it. And on the shelves behind me, there are plenty of those stories about the Battle of Gettysburg. Back in the 1980s, when I was working at the park, we used to tell the story about Spangler's Spring there on Culp's Hill, where troops from both sides would come down and they would exchange tobacco and have a conversation on the night of July 2nd while their lines are opposing. It's fantasy. Yes, troops might have come down to Spangler's Spring in the middle of the night, but they weren't trying to make noise because they were engaged in active combat at the time. Those kinds of exchanges happened in other places in the war, but not at Spangler's Spring. There are tons of those kinds of stories we could talk about, even with an event 160 years ago. The Confederate Lost Cause is another example. There are plenty of those kinds of mythologies that emerge even today. We talk about presidential inaugurations. They have a lot of mythology about America that are surrounding those in terms of our founding symbols and documents, and all those kinds of things are part of who we are. Those symbols mean something to us. And so mythology may contain elements of fact and fiction, but the point is this is a foundational story. So we've talked about myth, we've talked about history. So what about Adam and Eve? Were they historical figures in the way that we think of history? Were they the first people through whom all modern Homo sapiens descended? Or are Genesis 2 and 3 merely allegorical fables designed to provide a mythological foundation to the origins of humanity and the origins of sin? Good questions. Well, let's look at what the Bible itself thinks about Adam and Eve first. How does the Bible see them? Well, first, it's clear that the Bible sees them as historical figures, not merely allegorical or mythological. Now, in what sense are they historical? We're going to talk about here in a minute. But we see in the Bible itself things like genealogies. In Genesis 5, we get the account of Adam's line. These are the descendants, or the descendants of Adam. And then in Luke chapter 3, we get a genealogy of Jesus. In Luke's genealogy of Jesus, the line goes all the way back to Adam, whereas in Matthew's genealogy of Jesus, it goes back to Abraham. Matthew's trying to say that Jesus is a son of Abraham, a son of David, and therefore the Messiah, son of God. But Luke's point is to connect Jesus with all of humanity. Jesus himself refers to the Genesis 2 story in Mark chapter 10 and its parallels in his teaching on divorce. He's asked about divorce by the Pharisees, and he says, Moses allowed us to give a certificate of divorce. What do you say? Jesus says, well, Moses did that because your hearts were hard, but it was not so from the beginning. And then he goes back and tells the story of Genesis 2 about a man leaving his father and mother and cleaving to his wife and then becoming one flesh. So Jesus sees them as historical people. Then we get to Paul, and Paul most famously talks about Adam as the one through whom sin came into the world. Adam is a very key part of Paul's whole theological construct of thinking about the problem of sin, how it comes to us, and what the solution is. The solution being the new Adam, Jesus Christ. Now, the Bible does not get into a whole lot of speculation or even description of how original sin is transmitted. It just assumes that it does get transmitted to us. Paul doesn't go into a lengthy explanation. He just assumes that's the case. The point of all of this is that the Bible sees Adam and Eve, in some sense, as historical people. But then the question is, what kind of historical people? Are they the prototypes of humanity? What's the relationship between Genesis 1 and 2? That's a key question. Genesis 1, we saw, was a very ordered account of creation. It's set up for 7 days. Humanity's created on the 6th day, and it says God created human beings in his own image, plural, male and female. He created them. Is that just 2? Well, is Genesis 2 then a sequel to that to talk about just the 2 people God made, or is it a separate account altogether? I made the point on Sunday that most scholars see these as 2 different accounts with 2 different agendas, but put together because they're both important in filling out the whole story of who we are as human beings. The question here, though, is, were Adam and Eve the first fully formed Homo sapiens created 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, if you're a young Earth creationist, with no biological ancestors? In other words, Adam and Eve don't have belly buttons. Adam's literally formed out of the dust of the ground. Eve is literally formed out of Adam's rib, and they're the first people. Everyone descends from them. Now, that might sound fanciful if we're thinking scientifically, but even science kind of makes the point, and scientists generally agree now, that all Homo sapiens, all modern Homo sapiens, all derive from common ancestors. They call them mitochondrial Adam and mitochondrial Eve, who were around some 200,000 years ago. So there was a prototypical man and a prototypical woman. They may not have been together, but were in the same region. They're in Africa, and all human beings, modern human beings, derive from them. A lot of people say that science is settled. Of course, we know that science isn't always settled, but it is kind of the prevailing wisdom for now. So it's not that far-fetched to think of 2 people being the origins of all modern people. But does that mean that they were the only people around? Well, if we go back to Genesis 1, that may not have been the case. Think about the curiosities we have here in Genesis 4. If Adam and Eve are the first pair, if they're the prototype of human beings, the story of Cain and Abel needs some explanation. If you read Genesis 4, we see that Cain murders his brother Abel, the first real egregious act right there in the next generation after Adam and Eve. Sin is already taking hold, and Cain is jealous of his brother Abel and murders him. And God says, I'm going to put a mark on Cain so that people won't kill him, because Cain's afraid that someone's going to hunt him down and kill him. Well, who's going to hunt him down? That's a question. If they're the first people, and Cain and Abel are the first two offspring of Adam and Eve, and there's nobody else around, who is Cain worried about coming to kill him? And then later on in chapter 4, Cain goes on and builds a city. Where are all those people coming from? Either Adam and Eve are very, very busy, and so is Cain with one of his sisters, or there may have been other people around at the time. It seems from the text that there were other human beings around, perhaps the descendants of those created collectively in Genesis 1. This is not a problem that Genesis solves for us. It kind of leaves it open-ended. So if we think about Adam and Eve as prototypes, as the first 2 Homo sapiens, from whom everybody else descends, we've got some questions. Yes, we see it possible from DNA evidence, but at the same time, there are issues in the text itself that we have to try to resolve. One of the ways we can resolve that, and John Walton in his great book, The Lost World of Adam and Eve, I recommended to you The Lost World of Genesis 1, but this is sort of the follow-up to that, The Lost World of Adam and Eve. John Walton, who teaches at Wheaton College, I really recommend this book to you. It's helpful in sort of framing this. And this is a theory, of course, but Walton seems to suggest, well, he does suggest, that they are archetypes. An archetype is a representative example of something. So we might think of George Washington, for example, as the archetypical American president, or Abraham Lincoln as the archetypical American president. That's the representative that we want to hold up as President of the United States. I'm thinking of this because it's Inauguration Day, and we're all about presidents on Inauguration Day. Think about archetypes of other sorts. So the question is, could Adam and Eve be two of the people God made? Out of all these other people, that God chose these two people to be representatives of humanity. That at some point in history, in prehistory, before Abraham, God picked out these two through whom he was going to have a special covenant relationship, and they are going to be then the spiritual ancestors, at a minimum, of all other people. That's a really interesting theory. And one of the ways that Walton talks about this theory and supports it is by looking at these two words in Genesis 2, dust and rib, talking about the creation of Adam and Eve, that kind of lend themselves to thinking archetypically about this. So, for example, in Genesis 2:21, Adam is caused to fall into a deep sleep. God puts him to sleep, which usually is a precursor to a vision. It may not be divine surgery. It may not be divine anesthesia. It may be that Adam is having a vision of this happening. Because dust does not merely refer to Adam. And that takes us back a little bit further. You know, Adam is created out of dust. Genesis 2 tells us that. But then again, the Bible says over and over again that we are all made out of dust. Ecclesiastes says this. The psalmists will refer to this. One can be born of woman, in other words, and still be formed of dust. Adam was not created immortal. He was not a superhuman, an immortal human being, because when you read the story about Genesis 2, you see God puts in there the tree of life. Adam needs the tree of life because without it, he is mortal. And what's part of the curse of Genesis 3, which we're going to talk about this week? Part of that curse is they're going to be banned from the Garden of Eden, but in particular, they're banned from the tree of life. So dust is an archetypical term. We're all made of dust. We mark our foreheads on Ash Wednesday to talk about the fact that we are all made of dust. Not just Adam, but all of us, an archetypical term. And then there's the term rib. It's the Hebrew word, selah. I'm not sure the exact pronunciation, but it's used 40 times in the Old Testament, but nowhere else is it used as an anatomical term. It's not referred to as the rib. It's an architectural term. It's a relative term. It means side. We talk about the sides of the temple, for example, are made. That's the same word that's used. And so the implication is that Eve is built as Adam's other half, designed to fit together with him. They're designed to be a pair. One flesh refers to the pair returning to their original state. God takes Adam's rib, Adam's side, closes up the flesh, and now when they come together, they are a unified whole, meaning that they are one flesh, meaning that they are what they were intended to be from the beginning, returning to their original state. So those are archetypical terms. They apply, in effect, to all of us. We're designed to be partners together. We're designed for one flesh relationships in marriage, for example, between man and woman. We're designed to fit together. So what are the implications of this archetypical view? Well, it solves some of the problems in the text and with science, but it creates some others. For example, if Adam and Eve are archetypical, then how is sin transmitted from generation to generation? What about the doctrine of original sin? We're going to look at that, or at least the origins of it, a little bit this coming Sunday. And this is one of those parts of the Bible that really is baffling because it assumes that original sin comes to us, it's transmitted to us. Paul assumes this in Romans 5, through one man sin, all sinned. It comes to us in some way, but nobody describes the mechanics of it. Is it passed through the DNA? Is it in the water? Who knows? We don't know for sure. We only know that it does, and all it takes is for us to look around to realize the Genesis 3 story is our story. This is who we are. The Bible doesn't tell us how, it just tells us that it's the reality. There's certainly verifiable evidence that we are the spiritual descendants of Adam and Eve at a very minimum. So what's the bottom line in all of this? Adam and Eve prototypes, archetypes, or some other type? The debate's going to continue, and it will continue to rage on about physical human origins, about evolution versus creationism. Again, I think those are often false dichotomies, but the question still remains, and it's an important one to keep after. How is original sin transmitted? What are the other issues related to Genesis 2 and 3? But we have to remember, these debates were not important to the people who first wrote and read these texts. The bottom line for them is, this is who we are, and this is how we got here. It's a story that perfectly describes humanity, even if the details might be a mix of history, genetics, and mythology. It's our origin story. And whether it's symbolic, whether it's literal, it speaks to us powerfully of who we are. I love diving into this stuff. I think it's fun. It really opens up some of the mysteries of who we are as human beings. But I don't know that there's a better way to describe the state of humanity than we find in Genesis 2 and 3. And even Genesis 1, where we talk about the image of God. These are essential texts because they name our pathology. They name what's right with us, and they name what's wrong with us. And that's why they're important to study. They're certainly important for studying the rest of the Bible, because the Bible is going to keep looping back to Genesis 1, 2, and 3. One of my friends, Dave Heaster, who's one of my band brothers, we meet every week. And one of the things he often says when he talks about Genesis, and we get to a passage or refers to it, he says, stop, rewind, Genesis 1, 2, 3. And that's what we do often with the text. So it's really important to look at these texts and talk about them and think about them, because this is who we are. And it's a reminder also of who God is and how God deals with us as human beings. Well, thanks for joining me. Hope to see you Sunday when we talk about Genesis 3. God bless.